The senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I'd like to begin my remarks this afternoon by talking a little bit about the Constitution. I spent some time last week talking about the Constitution and our failure to observe that the constitutional fundamental structure of the division of power between the Congress and the executive is being violated, and the Congress is allowing it to happen. Another provision of the Constitution is the provision in Article 1 about advise and consent. It's a fundamental check and balance built into the Constitution by the framers for a reason. It wasn't a throwaway line or a few sentences that were put in because they wanted to fill the paragraph out. Again, it's part of this structure that was designed to protect us from tyranny. And the structure involved the division of power, the separation of power, because the framers knew that if all power was concentrated in a single individual or a single institution, that institution or that individual would inevitably abuse our people. That's human nature. That's 1,000 years of human nature. All power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the advise and consent provision was in the Constitution for a reason. It was in there for a reason in order to provide a check on the executive and the people who were going to be put in charge of running the administration. By the way, I want to stop for a minute and focus on the word administration and the word executive, because it really goes to the discussion we're having in this city, or in this country right now, about how our government is supposed to work. The executive comes from the word execute. And the word execute means put into action. It doesn't mean initiate the action, it means put it into action. The same for the term administration. There's a reason we call it the administration. They are to administer the laws. In fact, the obligation on the president in Article 2 is to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And it does not give the president the power to ignore laws or to decide which laws he or she thinks are okay, to ignore the responsibility and constitutional authority of the Congress to define spending. It does not give the president that power, although the fellow we approved for the Office of Management and Budget last week thinks that he has that power, or this president or any president has that power. That's absolutely antithetical to the whole concept of the Constitution as established by the framers. So, administration means administer the laws. The executive means execute the laws, not make them. We make the laws here. And the administration is to faithfully execute those laws. Now let's talk about advise and consent. Advise and consent means we have a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility, to consider each of the president's nominees for these important jobs. This isn't something that we may do or occasionally do. This is a fundamental part of our job. We take an oath when we come here to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think it's interesting. They knew in 1787 that there was a potential for domestic enemies of the Constitution. So we have an obligation to take advise and consent seriously. Now, I'm a former governor, as is the presiding officer. And as a former executive, I believe the executive should have the ability to choose the team that they want, to choose their advisors, to choose the people that they will work with some limitations. In other words, I start with the premise of the person elected should perhaps get the benefit of the doubt is a little too strong, but I start with the premise that they were elected and they should be able to choose the team that they're going to be working with. However, I think there are two qualifications. And by the way, this has been my stated position on this subject since I entered the Senate. Benefit of the doubt to the executive. However, the nominee must be manifestly qualified and not hostile to the mission of the agency to which they've been appointed. Two criteria that for me give life to the idea of advise and consent. Okay, let's talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He unfortunately checks both of the boxes as to being disqualified. Number one, he's not remotely qualified to run an organization of the magnitude of HHS. He has no background in management, no experience in running anything remotely like the scope and scale of the Department of Health and Human Services, no executive experience in that sense. So that's number one. Is he qualified? No, he's grossly unqualified. But the second box is my criteria. Is he hostile to the mission of the agency? And if the mission of the agency, HHS, is to protect the health of the American people, I would argue he is manifestly hostile to that mission. There's been a lot of discussion here today, and I think it's interesting. I don't know how this debate has gone. I haven't heard too many people come up on the floor and support this nominee and tell us why he should be approved. Because you know what, Mr. President? If this were a secret ballot, this man wouldn't get 20 votes. Everybody in this body knows he's not qualified. Everybody in this body knows he has no business anywhere near this position. But here we are. We're going to take a vote. Unfortunately, it will probably be on a party line basis. But let me focus on just one little piece. On January 29, barely a week ago, before the Senate Finance Committee, here's what Mr. Kennedy said. Quote, "News reports have claimed that I am anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither. I am pro-safety. All of my kids are vaccinated." I'll bet that came as news to a lot of the people he's been leading astray over the last 25 or 30 years. All of my kids are vaccinated, and I believe vaccines have a critical role in health care. I'm reminded of Saul on the road to Damascus, a miraculous conversion. A bright light was shown, and suddenly the scales fell from his eyes in his confirmation hearing. Okay, let's go back a little over a year, July 6, 2023. This is a quote, a direct quote. There is no vaccine that is safe and effective. He later said on the same podcast, vaccines are inherently unsafe. Mr. President, this man shouldn't be confirmed because he told the committee and the Senate something diametrically opposed to the position he's taken all his last 30 years, all his adult life. Maya Angelou said, if somebody tells you who they are, you should believe them. And he's told us repeatedly. And he has acted on his vaccine skepticism. This isn't something that was rumbling around in his head. He's traveled the world. He's written articles. He's gone on podcasts. He's gone on TV. And he's discouraged people from being vaccinated. And now he has this miraculous conversion 10 days ago. All my kids are vaccinated. I believe vaccines have a critical role in health care. The same thing during COVID. He said, it is criminal medical malpractice to give a child one of these vaccines. Wow. Criminal malpractice. And of course, it's been discussed. He said, I do believe that autism does come from vaccines. July of 2023, there was one study in England, I think it was in 1998, that purported to show a tenuous connection between vaccines and autism. I'm reasonably confident that one of the authors of that study recanted it. It was withdrawn, and it's been debunked over and over and over again. But this man has been peddling this lie for 20 years. And who knows how many parents have fallen for that, and who knows how many children have paid the price. Just to talk about vaccines, at one point during the pandemic, there was a survey, July 2021, remember that was the height of it. They surveyed 50 hospitals in 17 states. 94% of the patients hospitalized in July of 2021 were unvaccinated. What does that tell you? Vaccinations worked, and people who were unvaccinated were at enormously higher risk. 94% of the people were unvaccinated. In addition to the vaccination issue, This man doesn't respect the FDA, the agency that was put in place to protect our health, to regulate us, to be sure that we're getting safe medications, to deal with some of the awful problems of the potential of harmful medications literally getting into America's bloodstream. In December of 2024, barely a couple of months, 2 months ago, he said he would fire officials at the FDA. And in October 2024, he said on X, FDA's war on public health is about to end. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have 2 messages for you. Prepare your records and pack your bags. He didn't say a certain office in the FDA or a certain part of the FDA, or maybe there was one provision or part that he didn't think was helpful. He said, if you work for the FDA, that's everybody. Preserve your records and pack your bags. This man is not only unqualified, he's anti-qualified. He's a danger. We have physicians in the Senate. I believe that the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, should apply to Senate votes. You should not be voting for somebody who you know is going to do harm to the public health. So this is it's really a kind of surreal debate, because everybody in this chamber knows this man should not be Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, I want to end with a personal story. One of the few advantages of being older is that you have a long memory. And in 1952, I was entering the 3rd grade at MacArthur School in Alexandria, Virginia. And in my class in the 3rd grade was a kid named Butch. And he was horribly twisted into a wheelchair. I don't think I'd ever seen a wheelchair when I was going into the 3rd grade. But he was there, and here it is. I'm not even going to say how many years later, but I can close my eyes and see Butch in that chair. Polio was what he had. He was in pain daily. He could barely make himself understood. His arms were crossed, his legs were bent grotesquely in the wheelchair. And 3 years later, the Salk vaccine began what turned out to be the elimination of polio. Where would we be as a country if this man had been the head of the, at that time it was HEW, and somehow put a stop to this vaccine, which I believe he has said even the polio vaccine should be rescinded, which has saved millions of lives around the world? Where would we be? I can't escape the memory of that boy in that wheelchair. I can't escape the memory of my parents not letting me go to the public swimming pool because of the fear of polio, not being able to go out and play in a summer in Virginia because of the fear of polio that stalked the land. The former Republican leader was a victim of polio. The former President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was a victim of polio, and it was the vaccine that ended it. Mr. President, I hope this place comes to its senses and rejects this surreal nomination. There could probably, it would be hard to find someone less qualified to serve in this position. And I believe that it will lead to damage to our country, to our health, to our children. And I urge my colleagues to vote no. If you vote yes, you'll regret it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.